Video game sequels can be some of the best titles of all time, or some of the worst. It truly depends on what kind of sequel the game is trying to be. Every now and then, we get a game that objectively has the highest quality in its series, but is subjectively worse than the games that came before it. Basically, people tend to like original games more than sequels. It's actually quite rare for games not to fall into this trap too. One of the most known examples of this is Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. It's no question that Galaxy 2 has better gameplay, level design, and power-ups than the first game, but if you asked 100 people which game they prefer of the two, I bet the majority would say Galaxy 1. If we fast forward to the modern day, we can see the bias for original games with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Of course, both games in these Mario and Zelda franchises are amazing in their own right, but why are we so inclined to say the opposite of the objective truth? Well, I think it comes down to a few factors. First, we have to understand how first impressions affect us. Have you ever made a big change in your life and people start to look at you like you've done something wrong? For example, if you started to pick up other hobbies like fitness or music when you've previously just played video games all day, there's a good chance some of your old friends will not want to talk with you anymore. Well, that's because their first impression of you was that you were someone like them, a lazy gamer. A perfect match at the time, but even if you still play games with them, the conversations you'll have will be different and the energy isn't the same. If we apply this idea to how you perceive video games, it actually fits quite well. If you fell in love with a game's original release and you were charmed by its setting, the gameplay, and the music, then no wonder you would be shocked by changes made in the sequel, even if they're all improvements. When Tears of the Kingdom released, there was a clear divide in the gaming community. One group was extremely optimistic, hoping to fall in love with the same type of game that Breath of the Wild was. The other group, though, had a feeling that this game's hype had overinflated the expectations of the fanbase. Once everyone played it, though, it seems like players had come to a consensus that the game was great, but it just didn't have the same feeling that Breath of the Wild gave us. Despite critics and fans agreeing that the game was probably a 10 out of 10, why couldn't we enjoy it as much as the original? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that not everyone feels like this. There are plenty of people who still play Tears of the Kingdom every day and create new builds to explore the world. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this, and in fact, I'm glad that they're able to get their money's worth. However, there's also a significant group of people like myself who beat the game and haven't touched it since. Is that a reflection of my own mindset? Perhaps, but I can't absolve the game of some fault here. After all, when I beat Breath of the Wild, I thought to myself, oh, that was only the beginning? Versus when I beat Tears of the Kingdom and thought, okay, I'm done. Was there content for me to do after beating Ganondorf? Definitely, but did I care about it? Nah, not really. In Breath of the Wild, I literally just loved exploring the world and discovering shrines in the most random of places. When the DLC came out, that not only gave me more post-game content to complete, but also an excuse to replay the whole game in Master Mode. So what's wrong with Tears? Well, when a faithful sequel to a game releases, sometimes people tend to say that it's pretty much a DLC for full price. For some games this is true, which I can speak about later, but for Tears of the Kingdom, that's certainly not a fair statement. Of course, the engine and the models are largely the same, but there's a lot of new content here too, perhaps even too much. But despite all this new content, I would say that the experience of the game just feels a lot less genuine. Sure, they added the sky and the depths, but honestly, the sky just felt mostly empty and the depths were annoying to traverse most of the time. Some of the undeniable improvements to the game, being improved bosses and dungeons, were definitely amazing additions, and of course, building felt like it should have always been in the game, but there wasn't much curiosity that sparked in me like Breath of the Wild did. Ultimately, I think that the problem was that Nintendo was clearly trying to cater to both sides of the Zelda fanbase, those who appreciated the older releases more, and those who loved the new generation of games. Again, this is me being intentionally critical about the game. I'm absolutely not saying that it's bad or even worse than Breath of the Wild. I'm just driving home the point that your perception of a sequel can literally make it seem worse than its predecessor, even if it's objectively better. Changing gears a bit, Paper Mario is a unique franchise that has experienced nearly all types of sequels, faithful ones, unique ones, and even terrible ones. The first sequel of the franchise, The Thousand Year Door, is known to be one of the best RPGs of all time. So what did this game do right that Tears of the Kingdom didn't? Well, it had a lot to do with the kind of sequel that Thousand Year Door was. First of all, the game was a full generational upgrade in terms of the system it was played on. Going from the N64 to the GameCube was certainly a huge factor of why people remember the game so fondly. However, the true reason why Thousand Year Door is regarded so highly as a sequel was literally because they changed the entirety of the game except for the core foundation of what it was. The only true constant between the original Paper Mario and Thousand Year Door was the core gameplay. The setting, the music, the characters, basically everything else was different. This allowed Nintendo to improve on the original without reusing any content. Another game that did this was Majora's Mask. Even though I'm not much of a fan of the game itself, it's known among many as one of the greatest Zelda games of all time. Why? Well, it's because they kept the core gameplay of Ocarina of Time, but changed everything else. As players, we're hooked in because of the fact that it's a sequel to an amazing game, but kept in due to the unique gameplay. This is exactly what Tears of the Kingdom lacked for me. This is why people felt like it was a humongous DLC at times. Just imagine if the game took place in a Termina-like location instead of Hyrule again. Not saying that Hyrule couldn't be in the game, but what if they did kind of like a time travel mechanic where you explored a truly different world for the majority of the game? The sky and the depths just didn't feel like new areas, honestly, which was kind of what I was looking for. I think you get my point now though, so let's move on to another type of sequel, one that completely changes the formula of the series. And yeah, Breath of the Wild is technically one of these, but in interest of not talking about Zelda for the entire video, let's talk about Super Paper Mario. So over the years, this game has grown a lot on people, despite it being controversial on release. I think Nintendo kinda knew that a sequel to one of the greatest sequels of all time would have been a lot to live up to, so they decided to take the series in a completely different direction. And in the interest of making one of the best stories ever told in a Mario game, Nintendo decided to scrap the battle system of the previous two Paper Mario games. At first, people were confused and convinced this would ruin the game, but honestly, if we look at Super Paper Mario as a standalone title, it did an amazing job crafting a great experience. Perhaps it's not as engaging as Thousand Year Door or the original game, but it still captivated us with a story that stuck with us when we beat it. Ironically, the release right after this game kinda did the exact opposite. Sticker Star is a perfect example of how not to appeal to fans. Remove the story from a narrative-based game, add back in battling but in the worst way possible, and remove all unique NPCs. They didn't turn the series around with this sequel. They threw the series in the garbage and pulled it back out covered in trash. Excuse me for that, I've been avoiding mentioning how much I hate Sticker Star for the past 20 videos, but most drastic sequels aren't really this bad though. In fact, plenty of series have completely changed for the better because of a huge change in gameplay. Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, and most Nintendo franchises benefited greatly from a crazy gameplay shift. Besides that though, there's another type of sequel that is getting extremely common these days, which I'll just call the upgrade sequel. These are games that basically get sequels because the older game is just outdated. You can imagine games in this category being like modern Call of Duty games or sports titles like FIFA and NBA 2K. These sequels usually release every year or two, meaning that improvements are usually minimal and underwhelming, especially considering that these franchises do their best to include microtransactions wherever they can. The most disgusting of all of these is definitely NBA 2K, which targets an audience that already doesn't have much disposable income and asks them to pay $70 for a game and then asks for another $30 to progress in the game faster so you can brag to your broke friends. There are actually good games that follow this upgrade style of sequel though, like Animal Crossing or Smash Bros. With these, nothing much has to change with the gameplay because players are mostly looking for the same thing as its predecessors, but just more optimized. Quality of life and graphical changes lead the way in these kind of games. In Animal Crossing New Horizons, you get one of the best looking Switch games that doesn't deviate too much from the typical formula of the series. Sure, the game might have changed or left out things that would have been nice to have, but plenty of people still love the game 4 years later. Of course, with Smash Bros, people always love to see how the gameplay changed in each release, but more importantly, they cared about the new characters that would be unveiled. I'm not sure where the series will go after Smash Ultimate, but this was for sure an example of how to do this type of sequel well. But even if I classify these sequels as similar to the sports games, they really aren't, because these games don't release every year, and that plays a huge factor into the quality and improvements that the developers are actually able to make. But if you were to ask me my favorite type of sequel, it's definitely the kind that switches things up while keeping the core gameplay relatively the same. The most known example of this is the Pokemon franchise, but specifically I mean Pokemon before the Switch existed. Pretty much every game between generations 1 and 6 had the same concept and execution, but the setting, characters, and story were all different. This way we got that same familiar feeling every time we played a new entry in the series. As for my personal favorite series that does this type of sequel, I definitely have been loving the way Persona games work. Now keep in mind I've only played 4 and 5 myself, but I love that these games have the ability to change so much about each game while keeping the formula people love. While this series doesn't have that many titles, I think perhaps more developers should learn from how Atlus handles sequels, because it's amazing how they only get better every release. Some developers try to remove parts of older games just because they're replacing it with something better. but instead, maybe they could integrate that older content into the new game as well. Something similar to Persona 5 where Mementos is still an important part of gameplay, but it's technically an outdated feature from a previous title. So about that trap of people tending to like original games more than sequels, well, it's certainly not easy to avoid, but it's absolutely possible. Developers really need to put themselves into the shoes of the player, but also have some confidence knowing that they can switch things up if needed. Honestly though, I think a huge problem with sequels these days is the fact that they just get put out way too often. The entire Pokemon franchise has lost its heart because of this Call of Duty-like release window, where they just keep spewing out games since they sell well. I understand that developers are able to get away with this and live without any problems, but I wonder how long this will last until consumers actually start taking a stand against careless game development.